Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this special event for UK librarians, which is brought to us tonight by the Reading Agency. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to Paula Cocozza, whose new book, Speak to Me, is about a love triangle with a difference, because it consists of a wife, her husband, and his mobile phone. Paula is a staff writer for The Guardian newspaper, where she curates the column A New Start, writes features and interviews people of note as disparate as George Saunders, Derren Brown and Serena Williams. Paula read English at Cambridge, and in 2013, she won the David Higham Award to study an MA on the prestigious creative writing course at the University of East Anglia. Her first novel, How to Be Human, was shortlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize in 2018. Like me, she's a trustee for the Reading Agency, and she's held that role for 5 years. Speak to Me is her second novel and has been described as highly original, charming and very touching, funny and full of surprises, and wonderfully tart. Joanna Cannon talked of her writing in this novel as addictive and compared it to an Alan Bennett monologue for its sharp observations. Ultimately, it's the story of a woman's quest in a world ruled by screens and devices for a conversation that will unlock who she once was and what she really wants now. Speak to Me was published last month by Tinder Press, and Paula has kindly offered a copy and a badge as a prize to 10 of our listeners tonight, who will be selected at random and announced and you'll be contacted by email, so keep an eye on your emails. The chat is now open, and so please can you put any questions you might have for Paula in the chat. I've got some questions first. Paula's going to do a reading, and then Kimberly from the Reading Agency will be monitoring that chat and will ask your questions later in the session. So without further ado, welcome, Paula. It's lovely to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Good. Can we start, as our audience is a group of librarians, I wonder if I could start by asking you, what do libraries mean to you?
Libraries mean the world to me, actually, because when I was growing up, I did not live in a very bookish house. My dad worked as a builder, and his hobbies were kind of more craft-based. And he bought 2 newspapers every day, The Sun and The Express. And there were those 2 and the Avon catalogue, which I loved. But beyond that, I never saw my parents read, and we didn't really have books on bookshelves. So the library, which my mum started to take me to as I neared secondary school age, really was a very special place for me because I loved reading, and I became a devout reader thanks to Goring Library in West Sussex. Conveniently situated at the midpoint between school and home, it was like a halfway house for me. I read all kinds of things, classics, from my school reading list. I had a very inspiring English teacher, and it gave me a place where I felt safe to explore, and I could explore really freely in all senses of the word, because we didn't have very much money, definitely not to spend on things like books. And I think there would have been great pressure to go and do an apprenticeship at 16, as my older brother had done. But I just loved books too much by then, and I insisted that I would go and do A-levels so I could read English and carry on. And I think libraries really opened up all kinds of different futures for me. They made many more futures feel possible. And so I will always be grateful to libraries, and I always feel like I'm at home in one.
I should think that's absolutely music to everybody who's listening here tonight. Yeah. And if there's anybody here from Sussex Libraries, I think they'll be cheering right now.
I should say that Speak to Me is narrated by a librarian as well, actually. So it's quite a bookish book with lots of book references. Yeah.
I think also that resonates a lot today, doesn't it? Because, you know, in the cost of living crisis that we're in at the moment, I would imagine there are a lot of families at the moment that are saying we simply cannot afford to spend money on books, you know, even on secondhand books. So I think libraries are really important right now for children who in 20 years' time are going to be saying exactly the same as you are. That, you know, the library was their safe space and place.
Yeah.
So having built a successful career as a journalist, What made you decide to write a novel?
Well, I think I always thought of myself as writing because I was always kind of writing in my head, but I was very shy and it really didn't kind of occur to me to write out loud, as it were, or in a public way. Although I was a journalist, so I was writing in that way. But in terms of fiction, I was not, perhaps for the reasons that we discussed, I was not one of those kids who was always stapling together books out of bits of paper. And, you know, it didn't feel like something I had a right to hope for in a way. And yet I always was composing things. And then I had children and I seemed to have even less time than ever. And I think when my children were about 2 and 5, I just became desperate to write. And I think it was partly because I was so busy, you know, as a mum, and I was working 3 days a week at The Guardian. And this desire, this urge to write just became more urgent. And it was almost like a kind of a chemical thing, like complete exhaustion or broodiness, where you just know you've got to do that thing. And it became inarguable. And so I decided to apply to the master's program that you mentioned at the University of East Anglia. And partly to do it that way because I thought I would never find the time in the course of normal life to write. And there would always be something that needed doing at home or at work. Whereas it was a way of, so the master's was a way of imposing a kind of deadline on myself. I had to meet my deadlines every couple of weeks. So I had to be writing, and I could say to the other people in my house, I've got my homework to do. So I could claim time in a way that I don't think I would have done otherwise.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I've found since I retired that, you know, it's really difficult to discipline yourself to do stuff when you don't have deadlines. And so actually having that discipline, I think, is important. I'm also fascinated to hear you talk about this, because I've been a reader like you all my life, a passionate reader, but I've never had that impulse to write. I don't know. I've kind of, probably because I look at what people write, I think, blimey, you know, that is just amazing. I just don't think I could work up a character or a plot in the same way, but I love to read. I've just always loved to read. So I just find it so interesting listening to you, you know, having that compulsion to actually get out and write.
Yeah, I think there's such a close relationship between reading and writing, because I firmly believe reading is absolutely a creative act. We all bring so much to reading. We are creating while we're reading, co-creators of those worlds. So for me, there is kind of a big grey area where you're kind of reading and writing, and you're both things at once. And I think also I was very shy, so I didn't speak a lot out loud growing up. It was all going on in my head. And I think I just got used to kind of this little narrative that was always going on, and just and thought that, I don't know, I thought of myself as creating something. I just didn't know what.
That's fascinating. At the beginning of Speak to Me, Susan, the heroine, turns 50. Spring chicken. She talks about hating her name because it seems to her an invisible, and I'm making absolutely no comment on that at all. And her birthday just exacerbates that feeling. I've got this picture in my head of Shirley Valentine standing there going, hello wall, as she does in the film, and just feeling that sense of invisibility and not having anybody to communicate with. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking behind this, please?
Yeah, well, I didn't know her age when I started, actually. The funny thing is, I think when you're creating a character, you kind of have to, there's a sense that they kind of exist almost without you. So they exist and you're waiting for them to tell you things about themselves. It felt like that to me. So I heard her voice first, and I just started typing in her voice. And then I actually sketched her, because I delivered a creative writing session to the primary school, and the teacher said, well, make sure you come in with a picture of the character you're working on at the minute. And I was horrified. I can't draw to save my life. But I sketched this woman with a sort of a slightly bowed head. I think she just couldn't quite look the world in the eye. And I did know her name, and I did know she didn't like her name. And she riffs in the book on all kinds of, I think she wishes she was called Suze or Susie, because it just sounds a bit more 60s, and it's got, or Susanna, or, you know, just a name that to her felt like it contained more somehow. So I didn't start out with a definite sense of her as some kind of Shirley Valentine. I knew she had more to say than she had been given a chance to say, and I was there to listen, if you like, to what she was going to tell me. Yeah,
I can absolutely relate to that. I mean, I've been Sue since I was 11. And my name, I mean, I'm Susan, but I've never, I was exactly the same. But that's largely, I think, because there were 5 of us at my primary school. And when we were in trouble, we were called out by our first name and second name. So I just,
whoa,
you know, I hated it.
Still
Anyway,
makes you,
yeah, still makes me shiver at my age, you know. Please don't call me that.
Describing her in that way as sort of, she's definitely searching for something in the book anyhow. And I guess it's really a story of disconnection. She's married, she has 2 children. At the start of the book they're 12, and by the end they're 15, but she feels increasingly kind of cut off, and that's partly because, as you mentioned right in the beginning, her husband cannot keep his hands off the phone, and the phone becomes, as you said, a kind of a third party in the marriage, and she even names it Wendy, a reference for her to Peter Pan. So she really fixates on it. But of course, the phone is really a lightning rod. It's not just about the phone, is it? The phone, she's got her own distractions going on. She's lost a case of love letters, and she has this yearning for intimacy, and I think also she kind of, you know, she's got to find out where her kind of yearning is coming from, and what will satisfy it. And I guess really she's got to find her voice as well. That's kind of what she's doing, I suppose.
I mean, you as you say, the children are 12 and 15, but it's at that stage, isn't it, when you start to become, as a mother, you start to become less the center of their lives.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is quite difficult. I mean, that's when I went back to work, for instance, because I figured it was time that they realized that I wasn't there just to be at their beck and call, and that I had another life and another persona other than mum of. And I mean, it's quite, people react to that in different ways, because it's that sense of being totally at the center of their world, and then them gradually becoming more independent, which is what you want for them, but it's not always easy.
I think when you're feeling kind of misplaced, I think she says at one point she felt disinvited from lots of bits of her life, I think, because it's happening in so many different quarters, and there's a lot of change going on at the library where she works, because austerity is starting to bite, and people will know exactly what that was like at the time it first came in. And so it's a tricky time.
It is indeed. The opening scene in the novel, to me, is really shocking. I mean, when I read it, it hits you round the head, it makes you laugh, but it also makes you feel really sad for her at the same time. And I was completely hooked right from that very beginning. I was in that novel. I was in her head. I was really wanting to find out what happened to her. Can you tell us a bit about that opening section and what you were trying to achieve with that?
Yes, so it begins with a bedroom scene, and it's Susan's 50th birthday, and it seems kind of fanciful to say it, but in the middle of their lovemaking, her husband's phone begins to vibrate on the bedside table, and he stops what he's doing and he turns to look at it. He doesn't touch it, but he just looks at it. And that for her is already a massive transgression, because she feels very self-conscious about the fact that both she and the phone are lying in parallel, both looking up at the ceiling. She refers to there having been previous occasions when this has happened. She is so sure that he's going to pick up the phone that she reaches for it first and shucks it, hoping she's opened the window already. So everything is set in case he did do this. Anyway, the phone hits the window and falls into pieces. And I started it there because I wanted to think about what's the ultimate transgression for a person who feels they've lost all their intimacy to this phone. What's going to be the ultimate expression of that? And I know it seems far-fetched, but I spoke to lots of people while I was writing, men and women, and I spent a lot of time in chat rooms and forums, and this does happen quite often. There are many sad folks with sorry tales from the bedroom, just like this. I found lots of threads where people say, oh, we were having sex last night and my partner's phone went off and he stopped to take the call. Is this okay? Is this normal? And I think I'm kind of intrigued by the fact that so many of our taboos have gone in terms of our mobile phone use. And I actually thought I think this still is taboo. I think that's why it comes as a shock.
Yeah.
But I don't think there are many others. So I thought I would start it there because it seemed to really kind of put all the issues, lay them down in a way that was very close to the bone. And I really wanted to explore the impact of smartphones and that technology on relationships that predated that technology. So, if you start out, when I was, in my first relationships, we wrote each other love letters. And when we called each other, you had to wait till after 6 and it was cheaper, or we had rotary dial telephones, didn't we? It took such a long time to dial. There was so long to decide whether you were going to go through with that call or not. And I was interested to think about how for someone who'd grown up in that time and perhaps started their marriage at a time before smartphones, then how do you adjust to that technology? And what if the two of you adjust to it in different ways and suddenly there are new fault lines in your kind of old relationship that you thought you understood? So
yeah, that's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's very, very powerful. I think we were chatting before we started the session about how you sit in restaurants sometimes and you watch people on date nights and they're each on their phone and you think,
yeah,
do you not want to talk to each other?
They call it fubbing. It's like the word phone and snubbing. They call it fubbing. And there's been all kinds of research that says if you do it, if people who report fubbing also reports less satisfaction, contentment in their relationships, perhaps not surprisingly. So I think for my two characters, well, for Susan, the narrator, and her husband, technology has put them in two very different places within their relationship.
Yeah. So I think, Paula, this would be a really good time to hear something from the book. And I think you're going to have a reading. You have a reading for us.
I'm going to read a little bit from quite early in the book where Susan, the narrator, is explaining about her marriage. And one thing I should say is that while she berates her husband, or rather tells us all about his terrible addiction to technology, she does spend quite a lot of time herself typing away her thoughts. So in this section, she's sitting in the drawing room waiting for Kurt to come home so they can talk about what happened in the bedroom the night before. Ah, there goes the roller door of the garage. Kurt is home. We need to talk about what happened last night. I'll shut this down and continue tomorrow. No, I will not continue tomorrow. I will continue right now, because Kurt has come home with that damned slab of glass stuck to his hand, that small shiny coffin he's pouring us into, and he's standing in the doorway to this very room, not looking at me. He mouth talks into his Wendy, which he holds perpendicular to his lips in the style he calls cracker bread. I know this because after he quit his job, he spent days in cafes and parks near our old house to observe how humans hold their telephones in the field. You who, Kurt? Over here at the desk. Oh dear, I'm afraid he's neglected to give his nearest user visual feedback. He's forgotten his own mantra. A millisecond delay turns a user away. Type, type, tap, tap. Aren't you going to ask what I'm doing, Kurt? I'm keeping busy while I wait to speak to you. Since Kurt is unavailable, I shall explain about our marriage. We have a modern version of a long-distance relationship. We share a house, but we live in different historical eras. Kurt, who's 2 years older than me, has countless devices and respawns himself relentlessly. He is always the latest him, whilst I remain the same old me. I'm like a figure from a historical novel in my own drawing room, an anachronism searching for my moment. I do own this ancient laptop, though it is very slow. And for my birthday, I bought myself one of those clever phones that does more than make calls. But it is not at the vanguard like Kurt's, and I keep forgetting where I put it. I left it in the bathroom last night when I finally went to bed. There are buttons in this room I do not know the consequences of pressing. I suspect there are many women in my situation, and that's why the historical fiction shelves at work always require so much tidying. Only picture books is messier after a school visit. Ah, at last, Kurt's finished his call. He lurks in the doorway, head drooping. You'd think he sleeps standing up, but although his eyes appear shut, they are merely lowered. He is not sleeping, but scrolling. He hates it if I talk to him when he's busy thumbing, tweeting, dragging, pinching, posting, sliding, or swiping. It can be very hard to catch the moment when something is buffering. Since last night's incident, the only words he's addressed to me have been perfunctory texts about his arrival time and items we may need from outside. I worry that the thing that's really buffering is me. I'm stuck at one of those little beach ball wheels that turns and never comes full circle. I cannot go on like this. I push back my chair and Kurt ducks into the hall. Well, let him go. I was saying that Kurt and I are physically closer than couples who live thousands of miles apart. We sit on the L-shaped sofa, occasionally the same prong. We share a bed. We fill the kettle to an even number of cups. We do not have to think, what time is it, where the other is? But something close to hand divides us. I shut my eyes when that thought comes, to hide the thought or to see it better. Not looking can work both ways. And with my eyes shut, I really try to picture my husband. No, I failed again. I'm afraid all I can summon are his eyelids. They're the part of him that I know best. Those sad folds of skin and muscle communicate with me when the rest of him says nothing. The right one has a nervous pulse like a hidden button. This is the eyelid I watch when I want an answer. Brown shadows like bruises press two sad moons below the sack of Kurt's lower lids. I expect he's deficient in something. Given time, I'm confident that humans, even slow ones like me, will devise new ways to communicate with our eyelids. Maybe my boys and their lovers will tattoo eyes on them to foster a deeper connection. May their generation derive great pleasure from eyelids. May they fetishize them. May they eroticize them. May the poets of the future devote odes to them. Eyelids, the curtains of the soul. It saddens me to admit that Kurt's voice has become grating to me. On and on he drones on these after-work calls. I'd switch him off if I could. I wouldn't want to turn him off if he spoke to me. The house has fallen quiet. I did not notice the ceiling no longer vibrates with the boys' low-pitched bass line and complex beats, and I cannot hear Kurt's call, so I guess that too has ended, or possibly, because there goes the chain, he's taken it to the family bathroom. Kurt has a special quiet place in the bowl he aims at, and he's happy for interlocutors to hear him flush. I know for a fact he's taken a call from his mother while taking a shit. When I confronted him, he said she was going deaf. I do not know how to go about talking with Kurt while he has Wendy. I can see only one way to manage it. I must get the two of them apart. Speak to me, Kurt, or I'm coming for Wendy.
Wow, that is, I mean, it is just so powerful. And I think it, in some way, shape or form, in some relationship that most of us have today, that will resonate. There will be something that you think, oh yeah, I remember that. And I love the bit about the eyelids. And you know, that being something that poets of the future will focus on as a body part. I think that's just brilliant. So as part of the book, Susan looks back on a previous relationship because she feels disconnected from her life and lonely. And it's gilded by the passage of time. And like you were talking about earlier, there were proper phone calls from an actual phone box and letters, and she's lost them. And she's desperately trying to find them. What do you think this says about 21st century living and about Susan's response to it?
Yeah, well, so she looks back on a past relationship, and there are these little moments of where she's kind of reliving something from that relationship, and they become more frequent as the book goes on, I suppose, and the past begins to assert itself. I think she clearly romanticizes the past, initially at least. I think she feels that she had more connection, that even though her first love, who she was writing to, they didn't live nearby, she felt truly connected. At least that's how she remembers it. When she goes back eventually and looks at the letters, of course, she may find something different. And I think I'm interested in, you know, if you're, I'm 50, wait a minute, I'm 51. Gosh, I'd forgotten the one. I'm 51, and you know, my first loves were, I have love letters. I think many of us probably has a shoebox somewhere stuffed in the loft. You know, and I used to make calls on old telephones and from the phone box, and I think communication felt scarcer at the time, to me anyway, partly because if you're putting money in the phone box, you know, really you could only say so much. Now, you know, we have unlimited calls. When mobiles first came in, you know, we had a certain a more finite amount of calls. Now I think most phone companies offer unlimited calls. You pay for other things, and I think the lack of scarcity, we take so much more for granted, and the fact that our telephones are also computers, they're portals to whole other worlds that we're carrying around in our hands or our pockets. And I think, you know, there is always that sense that a person that you're with might be about to vanish into this other world. You know, how many small moments of ostracism do we all experience in a normal day or week? You mentioned the couple out on date night, but, you know, it happens all the time. If you're in a family, you know, someone will pull out their phone at the table, probably, or you can't even watch TV with another person now without them kind of checking their phone at the same time. You're never wholly in the same space in the same way, or you have to work much harder to be in that space. I don't want to sound like, you know, I'm kind of really got it in for modern technology. It's brilliant in all kinds of ways. I guess, yeah, and the book shows that the narrator becomes more and more invested in her own technology as time goes by. Her relationship to it definitely changes by the end of the book. She gives lots of little clues to her own Googling and things. So I don't want to say it's, you know, modern technology is bad and, you know, it was better way back when we had to, you know, wait days for a reply to a letter. But I think the attention that we felt maybe just felt more wholehearted. Perhaps that's the thing that I think is missing.
I think it's kind of, it's more, less is more, isn't it? It's more intimate, even though it's less, because actually if you write a letter, you are entirely focused on the writing. You're not distracted. And I mean, I'm just listening to you here and thinking about, I did a year abroad as part of my languages degrees, and my now husband, to whom I will have been married on Saturday for 45 years. It was a red letter day when a letter popped through the letterbox, so I can really relate to that. Paula, time is going so quickly. I could talk about this to you for ages, but I think there's probably quite a lot of questions in the chat. So I'm going to pass over to Kimberly now, who's been monitoring it for us, so that the people who are listening can actually put their questions to you before I come back at the end.
Okay.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, and anyone else can still add their questions into the Q&A, and I can read them out as we go along. So the first one is how I think everyone, even in just me looking in the chat, it's very relatable. There are things that you were saying that we're like, yes, this does happen, and making people kind of reflect on it. It seems like it would be a really good book club book. Are there any other themes that you think would be really good for the librarians to know about for their book clubs that they can start to think about for discussion?
I think, well, so I mentioned letters and old phones and phone boxes. Definitely the book carries a whole kind of, it goes from paper letters up to smartphones. So from kind of the early 80s in its timeline to 2011, which is when it's set. So that's definitely a big theme. There are quite a lot of there's quite a lot in there in terms of reading and what that gives people, and books. So there's, I don't know if it would be fun to look for books that are referenced. Like I think even the title is a bit of a nod to Anita Bruckner, so that could be a fun thing to do. I think talking about families and how families work is always a good subject, and looking for clues as to when the narrator herself becomes more interested in her phone, because she does drop hints. She starts referring to the number of steps she's done, or that kind of thing. You can kind of sense her relationship to technology changing, and also she's trying to kind of update herself. She does feel like an anachronism right at the start, and so she tries to update herself. So she changes some of the words that she uses. She notices nobody's saying, for instance, the word invitation anymore. They all say invite. And so she changes the kind of language that she uses. Nowadays is another one. Somebody tells her that word is actually for old people. So she has to keep reminding herself now. She says these days and now. So there are lots of little ways in which she updates things. And the book's written in 3 phases, which are partly the phases of a housing estate that they've moved to and how that's being constructed, and also the destruction of her marriage. And things do change across those 3 phases. So there are little symbols that pop up in different phases. So there's a sunset in the first one, and then it vanishes in the second, and there's a sunrise in the third one. So there are little kind of visuals that might be fun to look for what changes across the 3 phases.
Perfect.
Also, I'd be happy to, send questions or little discussion points to anyone who thinks of doing it for a book club.
Amazing. Yeah, I think we can definitely share those as well, because I know that it is, for me, I'm still not finished it, but I think it was great for a book club book as well. So that was a very good question. Thank you. I've got another one here. Is what's the difference, or how did you find it different from your journalistic writing to writing the novel?
Yeah, well, at The Guardian, for the last couple of years, I've been looking after the New Start After 60 column, which is based on interviews with people who've done something very different with their lives. And actually, I think there is a real common ground between writing fiction and writing journalism, which is really about being faithful to the stories that you're telling. So when I interview people, I'm listening really hard and trying to give my full and close attention to what they're saying, to what they're not saying, and to their body language and just their whole person. And I think it's really the same with fiction writing. You are telling a story as truthfully as you can. It's kind of irrelevant that it's fiction in a way, because if you don't believe in it as an author, then no reader's going to believe in it. It is real. You're writing it as a world that's come into existence for you, and you're almost channeling it. You're almost like a, I don't know, like a medium or something. It doesn't occur to me that I'm making it up. I don't feel like that. Not when I'm doing it anyway.
Perfect, thank you. And then I've got one more question at the moment, so please anyone else add them into the Q&A, which is what are you currently reading, or what is your favorite book that you would like to share?
I always read, and I don't know if this is a good habit, but I've always got more than one thing on the go, and then I read last thing in the day, so I see what I'm in the mood for. But I am reading a classic, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, by Susan Jeffers. You know, the classic self-help book, partly because in honor of my narrator, I tried to read as many books by people called Susan as possible, or with characters called Susan in them. And I'm also reading Veronica. I'm not quite sure if the author is Mary Gateskill or Gateskill. I think it's Gateskill. Mary Gateskill's Veronica, which is quite a heart-biting story about a friendship between two women set in the 1980s. It's got some very salty language in that one. And I've just finished James Baldwin, Another Country, which I just thought was incredible. Oh, I loved reading that. Favorite books, always think that's a tricky one to answer. We were saying this earlier, it's so hard to know your favorite book because I feel such a responsibility to get it right. I think I've probably had lots of different ones over the years. I love Hilary Mantel, the Wolf Hall trilogy, but also her memoir. And I love Henry James. And I love The Remains of the Day by Shiguru. So they're some of my favourites.
Great, thank you. Karen T has put a question in. If Speak to Me came to the screen, who could you envisage playing Susan and her husband? And who could be the voice of Wendy? It's a very good question, Karen.
Oh my goodness, that's such a good question. Oh God, I wonder if Sue's got any ideas. Okay, well, obviously she's going to be better looking than he is. Let me think. Oh, she's going to be maybe. Oh, I'd like to say Leslie Manville, but she's a bit old. Because Susan's only 50. How old is Leslie Manville? She's 6. Sue, who do you think? This is such a good one. I need like hours for this.
That's really hard. I mean, I suppose I wondered about Cameron Diaz.
She's very sexy though. But yeah, why not? Why not? The voice of Wendy. The thing is, Wendy doesn't actually speak. Wendy just looks kind of threatening in all kinds of ways. And you know, she has her own wardrobe, or Susan thinks it's her wardrobe, because he's got so many different phone cases, and one's leopard print and one's black leather. And yeah, she's very pampered, Wendy. I think she would be played by someone silent and I don't know. How would they do that? It's a really interesting question. How do you dramatize a mobile phone?
A very good question, Karen. I've got another very good dilemma question for you, Paula. A dilemma question is what is written. All copies of your favorite book of all time are burned / erased forever, or it's turned into a dreadful cringeworthy West End musical. Which would you choose?
I would have the musical. I actually have a soft spot for cringeworthy musicals. So and I get to keep the book. I'd be singing that in no time.
Fantastic.
I'm sorry if that's a bad answer for culture.
There's no bad answers. I think that's it for the questions at the moment. But back over to you, Sue, and then if anyone else has got any more, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've got just a little bit of time left, and I've just got one more question. I'm still puzzling over who I think would play Kurt, by the way. And that is, you set the book in 2011. Is there a reason why you chose that time and not the current time?
Yeah, so it's set in 2011, and that's the present tense of when she's kind of writing her journal that eventually becomes the book. And it starts kind of, the recent past kind of kicks off in 2008, which is when her husband owns the first ever iPhone. So they were launched late in 2007. So I wanted it to have in its kind of range the first iPhone, which really, when they came out, they were, you know, such wondrous things. I think, you know, and she felt it was marvelous. By 2011, I think almost half of all adults owned one, a smartphone, and so we were reaching some of the tipping points in terms of feeling perhaps a bit ostracized or a bit guilty about our own use, perhaps, you know, using them in playgrounds when we're looking after our kids, or, you know, out in the pub or wherever it is. And also 2011, I said she's a librarian, and that is, you know, really, I think from the librarians I spoke to, but people tonight will know better than me, that seemed to be a time when lots of changes were happening, when the cuts relating to austerity and the coalition government were really biting, and perhaps customers, users, borrowers, I think the book wonders about what's the right word. People who visited libraries were perhaps being, you know, counted very carefully and seen in terms of the kind of financial value of the service. And I think it changes like, you know, taking your book out with a machine rather than a person. Some people were still adjusting to those, I think, in some parts of the country. I don't think it was all at the same time. So it felt like a very fruitful time in terms of the technology and the economic impact on libraries as well.
Yes, I think I would agree that it was probably around that time, 2010, 2011, that it really started to bite. And for a lot of people who were working in libraries, as I was at that time, it just started to be one restructure after another, year on year. And interestingly, I've been watching Tarek Alexander, who's Battersea Arts, talking on Twitter today, talking about how soul destroying that is. How soul destroying when you're constantly having to.
Yes, because it hasn't stopped, has it? And libraries now there are all kinds of things, you know, they're heat banks as well as food banks and book banks and everything else. You know, books really are just one part of the life of a library. I think.
Don't get me started on that, because we'll be here for hours. But yes, I mean, it is one part, but it's kind of. I mean, I was always taught libraries are around about education, recreation, information and culture. It's just that the way we access all of that is now different, but that's for another debate and another story. I think, just to say, actually, I mean, in defense of mobile technology, I mean, as you say, I mean, you get sucked into this. I mean, Susan gets sucked into this as she's going through. But I mean, I have children who live in Canada and Hong Kong, and it enables me to talk to them and my grandchildren on a daily basis. Yeah. And without that, you know, thinking back to
and to see them
growing up and to see what they're doing every single day, and that's miraculous. I think absolutely miraculous.
Yeah.
Sadly, we've come to the end of our time this evening, and I would just like to say, on behalf of everybody, I'm sure, thank you so much to you, Paula, for joining us tonight and for sharing your perspective on being a writer, your thought processes, which I'm sure all of us have found absolutely fascinating and illuminating. And thank you also to everybody for coming along and sharing this experience, and to the Reading Agency for bringing us all together.